Greetings and welcome to this third video in a series on working through harmful religion and spirituality in order to recover the healing and liberating potential of religion and spirituality. Today we will take a look at perhaps the most powerful symbol of the last 2,000 years, which has been used to shape world history as well as the lives of billions of people, either directly or indirectly. The cross. Jesus has been used to inflict horrible suffering on people. In the name of the cross of Jesus, billions of inner lives have been mutilated, wars have been fought, women and non-white people have been demonized, colonialism and white supremacy have been justified, and physical and sexual abuse have been perpetrated. Throughout history, talk of God has been used to justify harm, but often not in a straightforward manner. Rather, as we saw in the talk on war and God images last week, it is in the name of sanctified high ideals, such as noble sacrifice, honor, allegiance, obedience, and so on, that God talk is misused. This presents an essentially ambivalent God image. A God who does harm in order to do the alleged good. One who demands self-harm and self-sacrifice as a condition for his, in the dominant patriarchal religions, the God image is male, of his blessing. It is precisely this ambivalent God image, this carrot and stick God image, that Jesus opposed. And this God image evokes in its followers both love and aggression. But the aggression must be repressed. When then somebody like Jesus comes along and speaks of a non-ambivalent, unconditionally loving God who does not hate, then that repressed aggression comes inevitably back up in people. It is for that reason that Jesus drew the repressed rage associated with an ambivalent God image upon himself and was killed. Because whoever questions the misuse of God by state, money brokers, and religion will become the target of the concentrated rage by these forces, will become a lightning rod for that aggression. The way traditional Christianity has interpreted the cross is that it means that humans have to sacrifice themselves, their own prideful will, in order to partake in salvation. That they need to stop disobeying God and obey by sacrificing the best of their existence. In the first lecture in this series on Drewermann's deconstruction of violent God images, I have shown how fear creates this kind of adversarial God image. Drewermann, Eugen Drewermann, if you didn't watch the other two lectures yet, is a psychotherapist and a former priest who is using depth psychology, is using psychotherapy to shed light on how religion either harms or heals, oppresses or liberates. And he is an internationally best-selling author who has written more than 100 books. Many of them are right here behind me, translated into more than 15 languages. And because he argued that religion, and Christianity in particular, has a therapeutic role and a liberating role, he got in conflict with the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church in which he was a priest. And at the behest of then Cardinal Ratzinger, who became Pope Benedict XVI, Drewermann, in a 5-year drama in Germany from 1986 to 1991, basically had a public dispute with the church hierarchy. It took so long because people, in fact, actually went on the street to demonstrate on his behalf. And when he eventually was disciplined by being silenced as a teacher in a Catholic university, and then was told he could no longer exercise his priestly duties in 1991, that led actually in Germany to a mass exodus from the Roman Catholic Church. But Drewermann was never interested in people leaving the church. He wanted to completely change the church so that it would look more like what Jesus actually was talking about in the Sermon on the Mount. So that gives you a little bit of the background. And today we will look at how he reinterprets the symbol of the cross so that it can no longer be used as a sadomasochistic tool to oppress people on the inside and on the outside. Sadomasochistic means basically that it cannot be used either to sadistically impose suffering on people, or that people can stop, and that people no longer will identify with this sadistic oppression and internalize it masochistically. That's where the term comes from. Doesn't have anything to do with sexuality in the way that the term often is used around as well, except that sexuality gets repressed, gets oppressed as well. So there is a connection here. But in psychology, the term doesn't necessarily refer to sexuality, but can refer primarily to aggression. So Drewermann argues that religion and spirituality deal ultimately with the fear of our self-aware human consciousness. We have to be realizing what religion actually deals with to understand why the cross was used the way it was and what it actually could stand for. So he argues that religion and spirituality deal ultimately with the fear of our self-aware human consciousness, of our human spirit in the face of death. We all have a reaction to death, to our own death, not others' death, but the knowledge, the awareness, the certainty that each of us will one day die. Our human spirit has the ability to what's called infinitize this fear, to drive it to absolute levels. For instance, in the form of nothingness, fear of absolute worthlessness, of shame, and so on. So you can imagine our self-reflective spirit like two opposing mirrors that create infinite reflections of anything in between them. The purpose of religion and spirituality is to calm this fear, because our self-reflective consciousness, just like the mirrors, infinitizes this fear. But often religion or spirituality increase rather than calm this fear. How religion deals with the fear of the human spirit decides harm or health of religion. The idea of God, of an absolute person who wants us to exist, is actually meant to counter the fear of death. But if God, him or herself, becomes infected with that fear, becomes basically the source of that fear, then religion becomes violent. Now, when our existential fear is instead projected into God, then God becomes ambivalent. Then God, the ultimate, is feared even as we seek that God. That is what happens in the story, famous story in the Bible in Genesis 3 of the so-called fall from paradise of Adam and Eve. And the result of this distorted God image by fear is that then, as in Genesis 4, the next chapter, we become to believe that we have to sacrifice the best of ourselves to try to find favor with that God, with what we believe is the absolute ground of our meaning in the face of absolute meaninglessness. God then is confused with a violent God image and turns into a God who wants us to harm ourselves to be acceptable, and who uses harm, for instance, in the form of war, to do supposed good. This is the structure of a violent God image. Indeed, Drewermann thinks that this is the structure of evil. Therefore, he called the book, the three-volume book in which he first developed these ideas, Structures of Evil. In German, the title is Strukturen des Bösen. In French, it's Le Mal. And it has been translated into some other languages as well. Now, Jesus opposed a violent God image, which is used both by religion and by secular power players to control people through infinitized fears. But here is the big problem. Jesus' death on the cross has been misinterpreted as something God wanted or needed, and was then used for that very purpose of controlling people through infinitized fears. So the very thing that Jesus tried to overcome was, again, done in the very symbol that was used to represent Jesus, the cross. So it has thus been used, this cross, to reinforce rather than redeem people from a violent God image. But that is not what Jesus wanted. Jesus resisted a violent God image, and that is why he was killed by people who were afraid of their own freedom, of the unknown he brought when he spoke of God in an unconditionally accepting way. If we want to avoid a sadomasochistic interpretation of the cross, that is an interpretation that inadvertently turns aggression in our psyche both inward and outward, then Drewermann says we need to understand the cross and resurrection actually in a completely different way. Namely as, and here I quote from Drewermann, as essential elements, cross and resurrection, as essential elements of a drama of the cleansing of the God image from its fear-based projections of ambivalence. So the fear-based projections humanity has put into God have to be taken back out of the God image, but instead, traditional Christianity has perpetuated them, especially through its notion of sacrifice. But in doing so, it is perpetuating the fear-based situation portrayed symbolically in the story of Cain and Abel in Genesis 4, who believe they need to desperately exert their human will to be acceptable to God by sacrificing the best of their existence. But as the story tells us, that does not represent a progress in culture or religious awareness. To the contrary, right after Cain and Abel, it continues. It only leads humans further away from God and becomes the occasion for further deadly conflict. Drewermann teaches us that a religion based on sacrifice and moral effort is itself the fruit of a God image distorted by fear. And it must inevitably demonize both God and humans. In the new Netflix show, Devil in Ohio, this is exactly how it is played out. God is demonized. God is basically turned into the devil. The cross is turned upside down, and the cult believes it needs the sacrifice of the best, the leader's daughter, to thrive and satisfy that demon of a god. This is a new show on Netflix this year in 2022. Sacrifice has meant in traditional Christianity that people willingly take on suffering in order to show that they submit to God's will. In that, they supposedly follow Jesus' sacrifice. This is a sadomasochistic interpretation of the cross. it suggests that God needs our sacrifice, needs our suffering in order to love us, accept us. While lip service is given that Jesus did it all for us, and that therefore everything is done, the sign of the following of Jesus, the sign of the cross, is said to be that we then also take on suffering needed by God willingly, just as Jesus did. Drewermann debunks this whole sick psychology and theology by using depth psychology, by using psychological theory to analyze the projections that happen here and by helping us take them back. Now, projection means that we unconsciously take something that is in us and put it into the outside, like into God or into Jesus, and then confuse it as coming from the outside. So in the case of the cross, in the case of the cross and of Jesus' suffering, we say God wanted it or needed it, when it is really human aggression that led to the death of Jesus. Theology is full of these projections, declaring that God needed Jesus' death on the cross for salvation, that God had these or those kinds of reasons. But this form of theology, Drewermann argues, in the end creates atheism, because humans will revolt against a God image that needs killing in order to be mollified. Humans will not put up forever with such a cruel God. Now, the big question is whether Jesus dying on the cross can be understood in any other way than as this willing sacrifice for a God who needs the sacrifice in order to love us. Put differently, why did Jesus get killed? And why did he not avoid getting killed? It is not, Drewermann argues, against Pope Benedict XVI, because God needed Jesus' sacrifice to reconcile the world to himself, as Benedict XVI quotes 2 Corinthians 5:19. He wrote that, Benedict XVI, before he became the head of the former office of the Inquisition in the Vatican, the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith. Drewermann responds to this idea that God needs a sacrifice to reconcile himself with the world, or reconcile the world with himself, pointedly in this way. And I'm quoting from Drewermann. That is correctly quoted, meaning from the Bible, but incorrectly reflected upon, because the problem consists in the notion that God should have to kill a human being in order to reconcile himself with himself. Such a thought makes God untrustworthy and appear bloodthirsty, barbaric, and crude, and it does not help to project the entire issue of redemption into God and away from humans while cutting out the psychological questions. The point is not that God has to be reconciled with himself, but that the human being becomes reconciled with herself by entering again beyond all feelings of ambivalence into a clear relationship with God. On that journey, it is true, there are a multitude of resistances, in the human being which have to be worked through. Battles, indeed, of life and death in every single case. So instead of hypothesizing that what God wanted or was thinking when Jesus died on the cross, Drewermann says we need to focus on the dynamics in humans that led to the killing of Jesus. Because otherwise, theology simply metaphysicizes the projective dynamics of the human psyche and spirit in the form of a sadistic God image. Now that means the psychological dynamics in us humans are not That means the psychological dynamics in us humans are confused as if they were external things in God, in the metaphysical area, when we project it outside. To avoid this, Drewermann says we need to shift from theological projection to anthropological analysis. How absurd the idea is that God needed a deadly sacrifice of a human being to reconcile the world to himself is clear when that same God is portrayed as being willing to forgive unconditionally, as Jesus taught. Here we have the clearest expression of the ambivalence of the violent God image. God kills, but supposedly forgives unconditionally. This ambivalent God image is very active when people say, God loves me, but I have to sacrifice ABC. That is the most simplest form. And by sacrifice, it's meant that they have to sacrifice something against themselves. Drewermann will go into how the idea of sacrifice can be understood in a different way, where it is not harming the self or others, namely where one can give up a one-sided attitude, for instance, of rationality, and we'll get to that toward the end of this talk. But that is not how Christianity traditionally has interpreted the sacrifice. Drewermann writes, quote, if God is willing to forgive unconditionally, as Jesus taught, there's no need for the additional atoning death of his son, unquote. So why then did Jesus die? What are these anthropological dynamics? And how can his death be understood other than by perpetuating sadomasochistic suffering in the name of a violent God image that is not trustworthy, but eventually only leads to atheism once people catch on to this absurdity? Drewermann says that we need to approach this why question from two angles. First, from the perspective of Jesus, and secondly, from the perspective of those who experience healing or redemption by identifying with his fate, with his death in form of a holy meal. Now, right there I have to say, because the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper or the Holy Meal in Christianity has also been used to perpetuate sadomasochism, it is very important to pay attention to how Drewermann interprets this differently. Now, in this second perspective, from the people who are identifying with the fate of Jesus, there are two levels of interpretation. I want to just say this here at the beginning to give a little structure to this talk so that you know what to expect. One is called an object level or objective level interpretation. One is a subjective level interpretation. The objective level interpretation has to do with what we experience in relation to others or interpersonally, and also to internalized others. The subjective level experience has to do with basically our own relation with ourselves, our relation with our unconscious, what psychology calls the ego's relation with the unconscious, with the imagery, with the dream world, and so on. And so those two, the objective level and the subjective level, are different ways of approaching the symbol of the cross. So let's first look at the question why Jesus had to die from Jesus' perspective. So right off the bat, Jesus did not want to die on the cross. He did not want to suffer. To quote from Drewermann's commentary on the Gospel of Mark, which is this commentary here. This is the second volume. It's a two-part commentary, and it's also been translated into a number of languages, and I'm working right now on a translation into English. So in this commentary, Drewermann writes, Jesus, quote, was terribly afraid of being tormented and tortured. He loved life, not suffering. In the spirit of Jesus, no slogan could be more unchristian than this one. that one has to love suffering in the name of Christ. It is Christian to fight as much as possible suffering, sickness, and insanity. It is Christian to commit oneself to life and the possibility of living of each individual person, not to preach suffering or to sanctify masochism. Otherwise, Jesus would indeed have died in vain. Death and the negation of life would as always have the last word. This must be said because no day of the ecclesiastical, meaning church, year has and is supposed to have as abiding an effect on our hearts as Good Friday. Often enough in the sense that God has loved us infinitely, but that we are sinners and murderers, that God's Son died for us on the cross, but that we shy away from suffering and try to avoid sacrifice, that Christ has given himself for us and took the path of service, but that we are egoists who want to be in control and want to realize ourselves. If these opposites were accurate, then the cross would indeed be nothing more than a signal of holy suicide and an embodiment of fatal self-reproaches and self-accusations. It would not redeem us, but kill us by perpetuating, simply by other means, what Jesus fought against most passionately. A kind of religion which consists only of fear and guilt feelings, and which amounts to a sadistic form of obsessional neurosis, which demands again and again that one has to kill. Animals have to be slaughtered as sacrifices, drives have to be suppressed as impure or wishes, feelings must be controlled as dangerous, and thoughts must be avoided as too selfish. The instruments ready and appropriate for the killing would already be at hand. Commandments, laws, regulations, and institutions, together with a huge heap of taboos, thought inhibitions, and punishments. Every religion, and this is very important, every religion not only binds, but also generates fear. So what Jesus opposed there is what every religion does when it is fear-based. And one, to continue with Drewermann's quote, and one cannot see that Christianity is a priori immune against being just as hostile to humans as any other religion, which has become ossified in loyalism and moralism. Here ends that quote. We see now what is at stake as Jesus faces the cross. Whether he gives into fear and guilt feelings that characterize an aspect of basically all religions, or whether he does not. But why does he get killed, as he is radically questioning through his practice of unconditional acceptance in the name of God, this sadomasochistic cycle of fear, guilt feelings, and inhumanities in the name of God? The answer is that he himself becomes the victim of this very cycle, because all the repressed aggression and fear is paradoxically now unleashed on him by the very people whom he wanted to free from that vicious cycle. Here is how Drewermann puts it. One thing seems clear. If one wants the mass, large numbers, one needs institutions and ordinances. One needs obedient colonies of humans. But if one wants the human being, one must value the individual infinitely higher than the mass. One must, as Jesus, be absolutely more concerned with 100 sheep than with the other 99. But the decisive issue now is, if one only brings into this world of regulated fears even a single spark of confidence and freedom, namely in the individual, the hunt is on immediately. Immediately one fears chaos. Immediately one resists them, confidence and freedom, as if they were the devil incarnate. One has to understand this paradox in order to understand why Jesus had to die. But one has to stop the habit of humiliating people in the name of God with reference to the cross of Christ and of destroying them through guilt feelings. One has to stop nailing people to the cross in the name of the cross and calling this travesty of religion discipleship of Christ. If Jesus had wanted that, then one would without doubt have to depict blasphemously a God who feeds on the suffering of humans and who, as the sun god of the Aztecs, only lives by devouring daily hecatombs of slaughtered children and young men. Against the pietistic perversion of the cross into an ideology of the mysticism of suffering, one cannot forcefully enough repeat, Jesus did not want to die on the cross, and he never thought to declare inhumanity and torture to be signs of true trust into God. To the contrary, he lived so that humans would receive back their dignity as creatures of God, so that they would regain their own innocence and uninhibitedness in relation to God, and so that this unceasing suffering which afflicts humans because of God, as portrayed in the religions of human history, would find an end. Now, in this quote, Drewermann also already mentioned something that will be important for understanding why Jesus did not shy away from the cross. It has to do with he did not want to himself give up his own dignity that was at stake. Drewermann continues, all the signs and miracles of Jesus transmitted to us speak for this attitude. In closeness to Jesus, it happened again and again that people who were crippled their whole life were able to stand up through their trust in God, that through his words they would receive back their senses, and that they would again be able to see the world as it is. In response to his word, they learned again to trust their own ears, their own judgment, and their own thinking. It did not pose a contradiction for Jesus, but was one and the same thing, to find God and to find oneself. Both happened for him through the power of one and the same trust. And the one was for him only the sign for the other. Precisely for that reason, people who understood him called him the light, because what he spoke allowed them to live and brought them to life. Exactly for that reason, they called him the way, because thus they found direction and perspective in their life. Exactly for that reason, they called him the truth, because through him, their life and all things around them found again their true Gestalt, because they could live in him as they were actually meant to and created to. They called him the Son of God. And killed him, crucified him, simply because he allowed them to live humanly? Yes, only for that reason and no other reason. Only those who had nothing at all to lose could follow him without fear. All others began at some point to resist his plain truth and to defend their inhumanities. Everyone tries in her own manner to defend against her nothingness. And those who succeed most are in the end worst off. Nothing is as difficult as to remain human, true, and kind in the face of fear, and not to escape into power, lies, and destruction. But this is what Jesus wanted to say and what his whole life was about. That from the perspective of God, we could defeat fear and would be able to live as free humans. Really, only for that reason did he have to die. And precisely for that reason can the cross, this cursed stigma, this monstrous embodiment of all human torture, become, despite everything, a sign of salvation. Due to fear, everyone has an interest to lie to himself and to hide himself so that he has to kill the one who tells him the truth. Humans kill Jesus not because they would as such be against God, not because they would be naturally egoists, not because they would be principally wanting to suffer, but because due to fear, not a single one has the courage to simply be a human being. Here ends this quote. We will get to how this could later be interpreted as redemptive in a moment, meaning the cross. But let's stay with the question from Jesus' perspective, as he was faced with the aggression that was coming his way. The choice Jesus had to make was not whether he wants to suffer or not, whether he wants to submit to God's will or not. The choice Jesus had to make was whether he wanted to give into the same fear, lie to himself, and hide himself, or whether he would stand by his vision that in God's eyes, each human is like royalty in the realm of God, and that God may not be used to instill fear in people. The choice he had to make was whether he submitted to the fear-based will of humans who cry, "Crucify him," and whether out of fear he would retract his challenge to a sadomasochistic misuse of God for all kinds of inhumanities, or whether he would not to submit to this and not retract his message of an unconditionally loving God. Drewermann writes, therefore, it is decisive for Jesus to show himself and us that what he believes is true, that it is possible to overcome fear through trust in God and to stay loyal to the truth of one's own existence. At this moment, when everything is at stake, words and miracles are no longer useful. At the end of the story of suffering in Mark, Jesus no longer makes a single comment. Instead, all that counts at this hour is to do the decisive deed, which the Gospel of John mentions so often, and which is the only possible and valid way that can attest to all that has been said and done, by risking one's own life through death. Therefore, the all-decisive question to us is, to what extent do we accept the death of Jesus as this attestation? If we do, then salvation indeed comes from the cross. In itself, the cross is the sign of the most abominable and the most base which we humans can do to each other. But if even the cross loses its power to instill fear, then we could finally and truly begin to live as humans. Then nothing would exist from which we would have to escape. Beyond the fear of all humans, we have only this single example of Jesus. If we believe him as to his death, then the world changes entirely. Against the possibility for humanity, then, no objection exists any longer, which in principle could not be weathered and borne in view of the cross of Jesus. Then all of his words of the dignity of even the least human being, of the power of trust, and of the opportunity for kindness are irrefutably true. But if we cannot even put our faith in the death of Jesus, then indeed the earth is now shaken to its core and the sun is darkened, as the Gospels portray it after Jesus' death. And we remain unredeemably what we have always been, inhumans of pure fear, living dead without resurrection. And to summarize this, I write in my book, A Violent God Image, which is this book and on which our lecture today, the third chapter, is based. Right there, the redemptive significance of the cross thus does not lie in the suffering of Jesus, but in Jesus' overcoming of the fear of death through trust in God and in his loyalty to the truth of his own existence in the face of a world and a type of religiosity ruled by fear and collective alienation. His refusal to compromise with a system of fear and death, with the way we are used to living, his refusal to compromise the truth of his personal existence, and his belief that not even death on the cross could destroy this nonviolent truth, could transform the atrocious symbol of inhumanity into a symbol of fearless resistance to all inhumanity. Jesus had to die on the cross not because God wanted him to suffer, but because we humans are under the spell of fear, terrified of the truth of our existence, and paradoxically we kill what would let us live. Not God's will, but the dynamics of fear in humans led to Jesus' death. The paradox that his tragic death could become a symbol for working through of an ambivalent God image, and thus for our redemption, can only be understood if we understand the anthropological needs under a spell of fear that were played out in the crucifixion and are played out symbolically in the ritual of the Eucharist, which Christianity connected early on with the death and resurrection of Christ. Now, what is very important here is that in the Bible itself, the death of Jesus was blamed on the Jews in the various Gospels. There's an anti-Semitic tendency in the Gospel stories themselves. And Drewermann says that we have to realize that there is a certain ideology behind this, which has to be deconstructed again by means of depth psychology. Because what Christianity did, it identified this religious attitude that we just talked about with a particular historical group, namely the Jewish people, or the Pharisees, or the Sadducees, or the scribes, historically of back then. But that is historically not accurate. And so we need historical critical research to debunk that. But we need to go a step further. And so in my book, I have a subsection that's called Overcoming the Anti-Semitic Tendency of Historical Readings of the Gospels by means of a typological reading of history. That's a mouthful, and I'm going to unpack that so that you understand what I mean by that. It's very simple, actually. A lot of harm has been done against the Jewish people by Christianity because Christians projected their own aggressions not only into God, but also into the Jewish people. Drewermann suggests that depth psychology can help Christianity overcome its anti-Semitic tendency, which began in the writings of the Gospels themselves, which blamed Jews, Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes for the death of Jesus. Historical research has shown that these ideas were born long after the death of Jesus, namely when the early Christians, the early church, tried to differentiate itself from the Jewish community. There were power struggles, there were fights. The early church projected their own conflict, its own conflict with the Jewish community, then back decades earlier into the time of Jesus. This false historical projection is at the heart of Christian anti-Semitism, and it must be reversed. Historical scholars have helped with that. But Drewermann writes in the commentary on the Gospel of Matthew that that is not enough. We have to stress here that he agrees with historical scholars, and so he writes here in his commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, which is This, the first volume is this. It's a 3-volume commentary. We have to stress here, at any rate, that the Romans executed Jesus as a self-declared king. Whatever, and he puts this in quotation marks, complicity Jewish circles had in the execution of Jesus, to fabricate out of it a main or sole responsibility has been historically completely discredited. Unquote. But what is one then to make of the whole drama of the killing of the Son of God as portrayed in the Gospels, which is at the heart of Christianity? Does it then not have to be completely thrown out? No, argues Drewermann. Instead, depth psychology can help us understand that when these texts are talking of the Jews or Pharisees or Sadducees or scribes, they're not talking about a historical group in the past. They are not talking about the Jewish people, but rather about the very attitude in all humans that we already heard about, and that rejects what could let it live, what could let humans live. Namely, that holds on to pseudo-securities of rules and regulations, that holds on to a violent God image due to fear. And again, Drewermann argues this is something that's in all religions and in all humans. All humans are susceptible to the danger of taking regulations to still their fears. So the references to these groups must therefore not be understood historically, but as mere symbols for types of particular inner attitudes that are present in all religions and at all times in history. And that is what he calls a typological reading of history. So it's not about that historical group, but rather it's sort of like, you know, poetry or a novel that uses certain characters to express certain attitudes. It's nothing to do with the actual historical realities. Drewermann writes, the type of attitude which Mark and Matthew portrays as leading to the death of Jesus is an issue of all humans in the ensnarements of a morally good will. That's the end of Drewermann's quote here. It is then theologically not important which external historical group was responsible for Jesus' death, but rather which attitude is portrayed by the Gospels as leading to the death of Jesus, namely an attitude of doing violence in the name of God or in the name of divinized laws or states. This is, according to Mark, the internal, that is, existential reason why Jesus had to die. Mark does not provide an accurate picture of the external historical facts of the people involved in Jesus' physical death sentence, but on an account of the historical implications of inner attitude shaped by fear, which leads to death on the inside and the outside. This attitude exists in every stage of history and can manifest itself particularly in religious righteousness and in a legalistic understanding of religion. And wherever this attitude is found, in any religion or any time, the death of Jesus is committed. This typological reading of the Gospels can once and for all end the anti-Semitic misuse of the Christian doctrine of redemption. This misuse was at the heart of so-called German Christians in Germany during Nazi Germany, supporting Hitler. This kind of anti-Semitism had to do with that, based on this kind of historical misreading of the Gospels. Drewermann puts it this way: we need to transform at this important juncture the historical exposition of Matthew about the Jews into a psychological and existential, church and society critical question, and may not let it stand historically externally. Once again, the anti-Judaism of the Gospel of Matthew cannot be done away without the loss of the whole doctrine of redemption of the evangelist, unless we realize that the talk of Jews, and he puts all of this in quotation marks, Pharisees, scribes, and high priests, means essentially something that lies in ourselves. Only when we take back into our own psyche the anti-Jewish projection of the theology of the Gospel of Matthew by means of the typological understanding of depth psychology, will we be capable of paying off the terrible burden of guilt of the Christian hate of Jews, and at the same time let that which Matthew really has to tell us come close to us in a liberating and redemptive way and share it with others. Here ends Drewermann's quote. The reason why Christianity has had such a hard time, though, to let go of its anti-Judaism is because it, as a quote from Drewermann, has tended to identify history with external facts, unquote. This brings us to a key question about the meaning of the cross. What is the connection between the symbolic and the historical, especially since we know that the most important stories in the Bible did not happen historically, meaning in an external way, in this way, in the sense that one would have videographed or could have videographed it or captured physical events. Yes, something historical happened with Jesus, but the question is what that means, historical. Christianity has tended to understand it as external physical facts. A physical virgin birth that then is used dogmatically to tell girls and women to be physical virgins. A physical resurrection that has been used to send soldiers in the name of that God into death with the promise of getting a reward in heaven for one's physical sacrifice. A physical breaking through of natural laws so that Jesus is thought to walk physically on the water, or that people are taught superstitiously to pray for a physical resurrection of a dead loved one in the here and now, coming back out of a grave, or in a hospital bed who's physically dead. But all of this really only leads ultimately to superstition. All of that has nothing to do with what really is historically new about Jesus. Now that may surprise you because you may all think of history as these external facts. But that is absolutely important to understand, that this is not what means historically. In order to understand this, we have to look at the question what religion or spirituality, as the more popular term for religious experience today is really made of. What reality does religion talk about that is both symbolic and historical? So what then is the historical uniqueness of Jesus, if we connect it to our question related to understanding the cross? So Drewermann, in that context, explains how we can understand historically in a different way. He argues that Jesus' historically unique attitude was this: the significance of the historical in the historical Jesus refers not to the particular time and space in which Jesus lived, but to the particular spiritual and emotional attitude which characterized him as a person, namely an attitude of absolute trust in God and in the dignity of every human being. In terms of religion, it is ultimately not historically significant to which race, gender, social group, or time period Jesus belonged, but which attitude he personified. So historical has to do with an attitude of a person. So what's more, the effect of his attitude of absolute trust in God and in the dignity of every human person was that it had such a power. So this is the effect. It had such a power that it evoked the deepest archetypal imagery, meaning psychological imagery from our dream world, of the human psyche and merged it with his historical person. An integration symbolized in the name of Jesus the Christ, which refers to both the historical person characterized by an attitude of trust, that is Jesus, and to the universal archetype of the Savior, that is Christ, as the concrete cultural manifestation of that archetype. This is key. Now, this does not reduce Jesus to an archetype, but the term Jesus Christ symbolizes the connection between the historical person in terms of his attitude and the psychic imagery that the early Christians connected with him as the Son of God. To continue, these two characteristics, the concrete person Jesus was and the archetype of the God-human Savior he evoked, together, Drewermann argues, make the historical person of Jesus unique. Through his person, Jesus conveyed primordial trust in relation to God, and he did so while evoking in others the rich symbolism of the human psyche that can have therapeutic power for mind, body, and spirit only in relation to an absolute person who is capable of calming the fear of the spirit, the human spirit. It is through the effect of the inner truth in history of the historical person of Jesus, of the particular kind of person he was, that we know him. And only because the stories of the Gospels employ the symbolism of the human psyche as a means for expressing the struggles humans face in their journey from fear to trust, can we today become contemporaneous with Jesus, know Jesus. So, as Drewermann puts it, is a quote, the effect of the inner truth of the figure of Jesus upon the self-experience and the self-interpretation of humans in the middle of the tightrope walk between fear and faith constitutes the level of reality, which by all means should be called historical. Of this eminently religious and therefore symbolic, hence unhistorical manner of biblical representation or presentation. So this is what this religious symbolism tries to capture, a reality that integrates the historical person in terms of who they uniquely are and the psychological images that emerge from our evolutionary heritage, from the treasure of symbols that is generated in our psyche and that has been called the collective unconscious and that has certain patterns to it. One can think of this along the lines of poetry, capturing the essence of an experience of who a person is to oneself. And one of the most beautiful examples of this is the poem of E.E. Cummings, a love poem called I Carry Your Heart With Me. And I'm going to read this, and you will hear the archetypal symbolism being used to express the experience of love in a historical meaning between two people in the here and now. The poem goes like this, or I'm reading a section of it. I fear no fate, for you are my fate, my sweet. I want no world, for beautiful, you are my world, my true. And it's you are whatever a moon has always meant, and whatever a sun will always sing is you. Here is the deepest secret nobody knows. Here is the root of the root, and the bud of the bud, and the sky of the sky of a tree called life, which grows higher than soul can hope or mind can hide. And this is the wonder that's keeping the stars apart. I carry your heart. I carry it in my heart. In this beautiful poem, imagery of the root of a tree called life, the symbols of moon and sun become expressions for the beloved, for the person one can trust and loves. And we have to understand, Drewermann basically says, the symbols of Christianity and of any religion, really in this kind of poetic way. There is a video in which he describes it. It's titled Great Speech of Religion by Eugen Drewermann. You can look that up on YouTube, where he spoke to about 90 to 100 scholars of Bible interpretation and portrays or delineates a paradigm shift from this external historical understanding of religion to a poetic understanding of religion. Now, the archetypal poetic symbolism that became associated with the historical person of Jesus because of the effect of his attitude of trust reached deep into the human psyche. For instance, the stories of baptism and of the transfiguration, which historical studies show are not historically true in the Bible in the external sense, and are seen by historical criticism as, quote, literary constructs of the faith of the early church, unquote, can then be understood as, Drewermann says, condensed, symbolically expressed experiences which really took place in the inner life of Jesus, even if they externally looked at never occurred in this way. By means of depth psychology, it is often possible to trace and make plausible a psychical truth in the background of texts which, under direct historical critical scrutiny, repeatedly vanish into thin air. So instead of reading the respective texts with a focus upon the disciples in the past, it is decisive to interpret them as the inner experience of Jesus himself. Only thus do they also become evidential and receive their binding significance for one's own existence. Here ends the quote, namely for us today. So the goal is then not to simply parrot church doctrine about Jesus as the Christ, but instead to have the same kinds of experience of trust in the absolute goodness of the background of life in God that Jesus had, which then transforms, that is, transfigures everything. So to sum this part up, Drewermann believes that based on Jesus' experience of the overcoming of the spell of fear of the human spirit, the answer which Christianity provides to the question of anxiety makes it unique. Christianity combines a metaphysical belief in the absolute personhood of God with a belief in the absolute personhood of each individual human being. Neither belief should, however, be confused with any nature philosophical claims. Christianity holds that only the experience of being loved by the absolute person of God can calm the human fear of death. That love creates an atmosphere of trust in which the images of the collective unconscious become images of salvation, that initiate a journey in which the concrete historical existence of the individual is gradually freed from the fear of the human spirit. The Christian emphasis on the historical Jesus thus has significant therapeutic reasons. In the 2-volume methodological work, Depth Psychology and Exegesis, and I have a copy of this here, the first volume, in German it's Tiefenpsychologie und Exegese, Drewermann draws an analogy between the relationships portrayed between Jesus and those he healed in the Gospels, and the nature of a psychotherapeutic relationship, which can only work if a concrete historical person, in therapy, the therapist, aims to provide an atmosphere of unconditional acceptance and trust, and thus allows the patient to learn to trust her psychic images. Theological exegesis, meaning interpretation of the Bible, can learn from depth psychology that the healing symbols and symbolic narratives of the Jesus tradition could never have emerged without a field of trust, as it can and could only develop around the center of a historical person. Thus, even though Jesus, as historical critical research has shown, did not directly, consciously teach many of the symbols of healing which later emerged in the Christian tradition, Jesus awoke those symbols in the psyches of others through the experience of a profound trust that he conveyed, and that sprang from his own relationship to God. It is this profound trust that uniquely characterized the historical Jesus, and that became the foundation for Christian faith. Thus, and this is crucial, Drewermann locates the significance of the historical Jesus not merely in external objective facts, nor in the abstract Bultmannian that of the life of Jesus, but in his concrete inner attitude that the historical Jesus embodied in his person. It is this inner attitude that is historically relevant, and it is in the historical person of Jesus as the one who evoked the symbols of healing in an atmosphere of trust that the Christian faith is historically grounded and through which it has been established. This profound experience of trust of the historical Jesus allowed Christianity to connect the archetype of the divine Savior with the individual historical person of Jesus. It is Jesus' experience of the fear of dying and his overcoming of this fear through an experience of feeling absolutely held by God, together with the fact that his message of trust and love provoked the deepest spiritual conflicts of fear and aggression that would tragically lead to his physical death, which both of these became the foundation on which Christianity could connect the archetype of the God-human with a historical person, hence Jesus the Christ. And precisely in this connection of personal trust and archetypal dreaming seems to lie the most important point of connection for a foundation theological establishment of what is specifically Christian. It is such faith, that is, such trust by means of which archetypal imagery becomes integrated constructively with the personal historical ego, which bans the type of fear that leads humans either to regress or to construct a rigidly rational point of view. And regression here would be where the historical ego is flooded by collective unconscious forces, or then by extension to the enslavement by collective social forces. The archetypes of the collective unconscious can lose their ambivalence only if experienced in relation to another human person who incarnates the absolute love that God has for each human being. The finding of self and the finding of God are empirically the same, even though they must be strictly differentiated theologically, in the sense that the finding of God is the condition for the possibility of self-integration. Now, this last bit is very important. When the archetypes are not integrated in such a way that they dispel fear, especially the existential fear of humans, then humans are susceptible in history to either regressing into the collective, where these archetypes require the sacrifice of the individual in the name of the collective, And psychologically, this means that the historical ego gets drowned in the collective unconscious, like in a psychotic stupor, as Jung taught us, and then can be used by collective social forces, be they fascist regimes, military officials, religious officials, cults, and so on. This can also take the form of using doctrines like petrified or fossilized specimens into which one simply has to believe in against one's reason. This is the great danger, Drewermann believes, in Christianity, in Catholicism, this fossilization of the archetypes, which have to then believe against reason. Now, the second danger is, instead of regressing, constructing a rigidly rational point, so going in the other direction, point of view that goes into the opposite direction and flees the collective unconscious through defensive rationality. In Christianity, this is the great danger. In the Protestant traditions, more so, Drewermann thinks, because in Protestantism, there has been a iconoclasm, and in Bultmann, the scholar Bultmann, Rudolf Bultmann, he contributed very important things, Drewermann believes, but his Protestant demythologization, which was an attempt to reduce these mythic images in the gospel texts to just simple existential thoughts, that strips them also of the psychic energy, Drewermann believes. And so while demythologization is very important to counter false historical claims, it is in danger of reducing faith to the simple that of Jesus' life, that Jesus existed, as Bultmann put it, stripping it of any real energy and eventually making it simply into a rational, moralistic faith. Both of these ways eventually lead to atheism, Drewermann believes. The first because reason will assert itself. The second because, as the new atheists, like Richard Dawkins, have argued, societies do not need explicit religious faith to establish morality. Now, having said all of this, we have so far looked at the cross from the perspective of the historical Jesus, but what was it in humans that led them to kill Jesus? We already have touched briefly on that, but how could the cross be seen not as something that harms, but that is a symbol for healing? Here, Drewermann says, Christianity and really all religions have to learn from the process of psychotherapy, which is built fundamentally on trust, that all the feelings and thoughts are allowed to be expressed and worked through in a safe space in relation to the therapist. The therapy model that Drewermann finds most useful for understanding how the symbol of the cross can be a symbol of redemption is the transference model of psychoanalysis. Now, transference means that the patient or client puts feelings and expectations upon the therapist, which do not belong to them, but which instead come from early childhood patterns of the relationship with the parents. But these patterns are now becoming clear as the patient projects them onto the therapist. What does this exactly look like? When people go into therapy, they bring their hopes and longings for change to therapy, including the deepest longings for trust and security that they wish they had experienced early in life but did not. Now, as they experience that finally here, they find a safe place to be truly themselves, which in the past they had feared they could not because they might lose the love of the parents or caregivers or get somehow punished by them. Now it's not only the old feelings of longing for trust and a sense of hold that come up in relation to the therapist. Instead, in that safe therapeutic space, Drewermann writes, all of the feelings that had been repressed in the past of disappointment, of revenge, of anger, of jealousy, of rage, of powerlessness, of loneliness, of guilt, and of reparation also come up. Drewermann likens the work of the therapist to the situation in the Sermon on the Mount. If someone asks you to go with them 1 mile, go with them 2. That means it is not enough to just go into the positive longings. One has to work through all the disappointments, the grief, the anger, in order for the patient to harness the very energies that got stuck in those as well. Now, the way this happens is experiential. The patient feels, for instance, that the therapist may not care about her because the therapist is ending the session on time, just as the patient is getting into some really important material. The therapist, Drewermann says, thus must adopt the parent's or caregiver's role for a long period of time by trying to be understanding, as the parents of the patient in her childhood actually would have had to be. He sets free for the first time all the aggressions, cravings for revenge, and power struggles around the fact that her father and mother were back then not exactly as she would have needed them in order for her own life to unfold without falsifications. So the therapist takes on a vicarious role. And this is exactly what Jesus did, although he did not understand that this was the psychological process happening, as we today can understand due to the insights of psychoanalysis. The experience of unconditional acceptance is where the aims of Jesus and the aims of psychoanalysis converge, and, Drewermann argues, where psychoanalysis can experientially be more than a model for redemption. But this experiential convergence requires that psychoanalysis draw the theoretical consequence and acknowledge that its notion of unconditional acceptance and trust can only stand on a theological basis. Drewermann's integration of theology and depth psychology attempts to overcome both, quote, the soullessness of today's theology, unquote, and, quote, theoretical atheism of today's psychology, unquote. He clarifies the experiential connection between psychoanalysis and the process of redemption, and the theoretical difference between the reconciliation in psychoanalysis and in Christian theology. The experiential connection lies in the attitude of unconditional acceptance, which characterizes both psychoanalysis and the Christian doctrine of redemption, and implies in both a necessary suspension of the ethical in Kierkegaard's sense. By suspension of the ethical, Drewermann means that psychoanalysis and the Christian doctrine of redemption basically have a non-judgmental approach that does not judge people as immoral, but instead tries to understand the deeper reasons for their behavior or attitudes. Now, while psychoanalysis or psychotherapy in general deals theoretically with the psychosocial experience of learning to trust in the present and work through the reasons in the past that led to fearful existence, religion and theology is fundamentally no longer concerned only about regaining the past, but far more about forming a primal trust in the background of her existence as a whole in the here and now. However, Drewermann emphasizes that psychoanalytic practice, if successful, may lead in itself to experiences of religious quality, which centrally shape Christianity. Yet, within its theory, psychoanalysis cannot establish a basis for the absolute trust necessary for this experience. This, Drewermann believes, requires a theological basis, that is, the belief in the unambivalent and absolute affirmation of our existence. Theologically speaking, psychoanalysis presupposes a non-ambivalent, non-violent God image, and is itself a tool for the working through of the ambivalence associated in a patriarchal society with the image of a father God. Drewermann writes, no psychoanalytic treatment can be the foundation of this trust. All it can do is clear away the psychological reasons which get in the way of such a fundamental attitude of trust. But in doing so, the analytic practice of treatment itself presupposes a spiritual conviction, such as the one which the religion of Jesus essentially wants to catalyze. the conviction that the origin of our existence, beyond all the ambivalence necessarily contained in the image of the human parents, does not need to be imagined in itself as frightening, rejecting, hostile, revengeful, and jealous. It would indeed equal the slander and falsification of God if one wanted to transfer the fears and ambiguities which are common among humans into the relationship to God. Psychoanalysis, as well as religion, in that sense, aim together, although with different approaches, at the cleansing and clarification of the father image, at the end of Oedipal sadism. And we'll get in a moment to what Oedipal means in this context. The psychological experience, this ends the quote of Drewermann, the psychological experience of not being loved or accepted for who one truly is by parents or caregivers and their successors can get superimposed on the existential experience of whether we feel loved or accepted in life, period. So not just by those humans we want to be loved by, but by in our existence, period. We may not feel justified psychologically. We may be told we are a nuisance, superfluous to somebody. And we can work on this psychologically and stop believing that what we experience in relation to this person is the whole truth about us. Others may love us and accept us than those caregivers who might not have. But existentially, we cannot do the same thing. Because existentially, quote, the feeling of being ultimately unjustified and superfluous in this world, unquote, is a fundamental experience that emerges with the awareness of death, of our personal death. In the face of death, we experience ultimate nothingness. If we do not find a hold that is stronger than death, which by definition can be nothing that is itself marked by death. No human being, no job, no ability, no accomplishment. So if we do not find a hold that is stronger than death, if we cannot find something stronger than death to ground us, then we are in the grip of the spell of existential fear. This fear can show up, for instance, in desperate attempts to gain some justification to exist, either by denying ourselves as much as we can in order to appear good in the eyes of the other, or by striving mercilessly toward a perfection in which no human weakness has a place. And this leads us to want to kill off the one who upsets this life of fear. This is exactly what happens in psychoanalysis, or really in any other form of psychotherapy. Resistance to this therapeutic process because of the fear of letting their symptoms, the painful forms of a substitute life, crumble. And this too is what happened existentially with people whom Jesus gave space to think and feel God as an unconditionally accepting God, unambivalent. They started to become afraid and resistant and tried to kill him off, get him out of their life so that their substitute life could be maintained. So only when one is cognizant of the deepest human experience of fear, guilt, and aggression can one make the cruel event of the crucifixion intelligible and understand why it could take on symbolic meaning as a therapeutic cipher of redemption for the whole human being. In Drewermann's words, and I quote, one understands the paradoxical human meaning of many words and references in the Gospel of Mark in relation to the necessity of suffering, to the inevitability of the cross, and to the resurrection from the realm of the dead, only in the sense of such a therapeutic working through of the most difficult feelings of anxiety and guilt, which a human being can live through, namely the primordial fear of and the primordial protest against being unjustified and unloved on earth. If we do not understand that the cross became such a powerful event, because here the very person who, for the first time, brought so clearly and sustained the message of an unambivalent, unconditionally accepting God into the lives of people, drew all the fears, aggressions that were repressed in the name of the ambivalent God image, then upon himself, then we will only reinforce the ambivalent God image that Jesus actually tried to overcome. That is, unfortunately, exactly what has happened in Christianity. We need to understand the powerful effects of this ambivalence, because through it, our fears can turn the best intentions we have into its opposite. We may want to be free, but we're also terribly afraid of freedom and may do the very thing that keeps us only more unfree and afraid. Like the scenario in the symbolic story of Adam and Eve, or like nailing someone on the cross, or like waging war. That is called the counter-finality of aim and result, which is unconscious to us. And what that means is that basically, that what we aim for, actually, we get the opposite of it. And so Christianity has misunderstood the cross as a form of ascetic moralism, which is the exact opposite of what Jesus preached. It has distorted, to quote Drewermann, the religion of freedom and redemption into an ideology of obsessive compulsive nightmares within which the God of Jesus Christ has to appear even more horrible than the bloodthirsty gods of war, of the sun, and of fertility of the Mesoamerican Aztecs, as Huitzilopochtli, Tonatiuh, and Xipetotec, which means literally the Lord the oppressor. In a redemptive sense, as a therapeutic cipher, the death of Jesus on the cross means precisely that it is not worth being afraid of humans, because it is no longer necessary to be afraid of God. It was and is precisely this belief of Jesus which found expression in all his words to and encounters with humans, and which was confirmed in his death. We humans may do what we want and we can have done what we want. The first and the most important word of God on all human fear and guilt will be a word of understanding and a word of forgiveness. Exactly because this contradicts at first everything which we have become accustomed to learn and to follow in our everyday life, this conviction of Jesus generates at first a tremendous resistance. In other words, it washes up all the repressed feelings that are actually meant for those who made us afraid in the first place. Because our earliest feelings of ambivalence lie in our earliest developmental experience and relate to food, to, as psychoanalysis calls it, oral needs, needs for nurture. So we feel ambivalent if we do not get enough nurture, or if we are being stuffed and are expected to, just as English puts it, suck it all up. So because that's where the earliest feelings of ambivalence are located, the religious symbolism that deals with our attempt to create a justification for existence, to matter ultimately, deals also with the most primal evolutionary forms of aggression, what psychoanalysis has called oral sadism. That is the unconscious reason why the early church connected the death of Jesus with the words of the Last Supper, or the Eucharist. Therefore, there is no, this is to quote Drewermann, there is no other way than to evoke and relive vicariously in relation to a new mother and father figure this whole drama of fear in form of an oral ritual until it becomes clear and trustworthy enough that God is more fatherly than any father and more motherly than any mother. Unambiguously, God wants us to live. Even if we are as bad as we have been taught to fear, we are since our childhood, God nevertheless wants us to live beyond death, beyond guilt, and beyond fear. Because only in this trust of God, when all the distorting masks of duty, of possessions, and of cruelty have been lifted out and laid down, will we notice how rich and how valuable we truly are. Exactly for that reason, the crucified Christ becomes bread for the world, because he embodies in his life as well as in the manner of his death an abiding certainty. what no mother is able to tell her child, God with no ambiguity, whatever wants to say to the human being, we are allowed to live without having to wrap the simple fact of our existence in shrouds of old feelings of fear and of guilt. God is like bread and wine, like flesh and blood, primordially maternal from the beginning. Here ends that quote. But Christianity does something absolutely important in addition to working through this most profound oral form of aggression. It not only worked through oral aggression, but it directed it directly at God. It connected the fate of the human being, Jesus, with God by interpreting Jesus as the stand-in for God the Father. Jesus was seen as the Son of God, and God was seen as the one who had taken the guilt humans had upon himself. This all happened in a patriarchal culture, that's why himself. So it was only in hindsight that the early church identified God with Jesus. In the course of dogmatics, Jesus became God. Drewermann argues that we have to understand what happened here psychologically so that we do not reify it theologically, so that we do not reify theologically sadism in the name of God. So what happened here psychologically and theologically, Drewermann argues, is that the cross was interpreted by early Christians in such a way that the aim of human aggression that had led to the death of Jesus was eventually, in the symbolism of the Holy Meal, of the Holy Eucharist, directed from humans onto God. And only when the cross is seen as the symbol in which God bears all of our aggression will it be possible to stop putting the cross in sadomasochistic ways onto people. As I write in my book on page 255, Drewermann now elaborates that the redemptive significance in the symbol of the cross is that it gives humans absolute permission to put all their repressed murderous, oral, anal, Oedipal aggression on God, who is capable of bearing it. The universal presence of sacred meals of the Godhead in religion suggests the archetypal nature of this ritual. And all these different types of aggression are connected to developmental stages that psychoanalysis has outlined. Now, but instead of staying with the reality that it was human fears and aggressions that led to the killing of Jesus because of his non-ambivalent, unconditionally accepting God image, Christianity quickly projected these human conflicts around aggression into the God image itself. Remember the idea that Drewermann took on, that Ratzinger, Benedict XVI had, that God had to be reconciled with himself. That's the conflict that has been projected from humans into God. And theologians started to get busy trying to understand what God thought and create monstrous ideas that God needed the cross to redeem suffering, to redeem humans. In fact, the whole question of so-called theodicy, why does God let bad things happen to good people, is just one other instance of this, as if God is doing these kinds of things, is sort of being aggressive in some sense. Drewermann argues we have to shift the perspective and not ask what God does, but look at how we ourselves are creating harm and aggression. Drewermann argues that to avoid these harmful interpretations of the cross, we need, quote, a psychoanalytic demythologization, unquote, that helps us take back the projections we have put into the God image that demonized it as well as human beings. What we need is the very same attitude of Jesus, which struggles, quote, for the clarification and purification of the God image from all ambivalences and admixtures of distorting fear, unquote. Drewermann explains that one can only understand the God of Good Friday as a cipher of redemption if one thinks and argues psychologically from the perspective of humans rather than theologically from the perspective of God. Here he is deeply indebted to the experiences and descriptions of Freud of the archaic crudeness of the human psyche, although he fiercely rejects Freud's reduction of religion to a neurotic offshoot of the Oedipus complex. Based on the real existing Catholicism in Vienna, Freud believed that Christianity was basically an obsessive-compulsive neurosis that demanded submission of people in the name of the cross of Christ to a strict ambivalent God image. This form of Christianity is unfortunately alive and well, justifies wars, the suppression of women, the exploitation of nature, even racism, and so on. But Drewermann argues that if we use psychoanalysis to take back the human projections of ambivalence into the God image, then the Oedipus complex, that is existentially the attempt to be one's own father or mother, to create one's own ground existentially, the attempt to play God can first be overcome. I sum this up on page 260 of my book, A Violent God Image. By acting out in the ritual of the eating of the Godhead, the infinitized and repressed aggressions, psychologically both oral and Oedipal aggressions, which are the very fuel for the competitive strife of replacing God and of becoming like God, the Oedipus complex can be worked through by means of religion rather than perpetuated by it, as Freud thought. The Oedipus complex, this fear-based complex focusing around guilty submission to or enraged rebellion against God, the ambivalent father or mother, is overcome when one experiences through that ritual in which God does not punish us for our deadly aggressions, but willingly takes them upon himself and unconditionally accepts and justifies us, that God is not someone to be feared and hence cannot be used by humans to intimidate other humans. Just as the one-sidedly rational ego dies, which itself is a result of repression of the unconscious under the spell of fear, so the one-sidedly rational God image dies intrapsychically. A non-ambivalent God image emerges that is existentially both more motherly and more fatherly than any mother or father could ever be. It is then, Drewermann believes, that humans can cease to have to become like God or turn other humans into gods, and that the God image can cease to become like an ambivalent human being. We now no longer need to sacrifice ourselves to God or others because God takes the fear of groundlessness away from us, takes away the guilt feelings we have for needing to symbolically kill in order to live. By connecting the fate of Jesus with God dying for us and with the symbol of the eating of the Godhead, Christianity speaks the human being absolutely free from guilt. And here's a quote from Drewermann: "No God can do more in order to take the fear away from us than to die for us in this cruel way as a human being." Now, this does not, again, speak about in any way rationalizing the actual death of Jesus. This is only once that cruel death has been understood as a symbol for the aggression being turned toward God. That is why that event became such a symbol, but the event itself is just cruel. Now, so far, we have interpreted the symbol of the cross as something that deals with fear and guilt in relation to another person, whether it is God or the psychotherapist in the Transference. Drewermann calls this object, he calls this the object level aspect. That term comes from psychology and has to do with the idea that we form in our psyche representations of the most significant caregivers early in us, which psychology then, these representations, calls objects. And so the relation is to an internal object, or to either the internalized parents, internalized therapist, internalized God. So there is a direct relation to that object. But the symbol of the cross also has a subjective level aspect, where it is a symbol for the inner process of integration of one's own self. And I will conclude with this in the last few minutes here. where it is a symbol for the inner process of integration of one's own self, of one's own subjectivity, hence on the subjective level. On this level, Christianity connected the experience of the cross with the symbol of baptism and rebirth. Carl Gustav Jung has written much about this process. To understand it, we must reflect on what constitutes us as humans on the inside psychologically. The question then is, how can the symbol of the cross lead to a change within the human psyche and spirit? That is, how can it lead to intrapsychic change so that the one-sidedness which characterizes the human psyche and the spirit under the spell of fear can give way to a true integration of consciousness and the unconscious, reason and the drives, or the evolutionary desires or wishes and so on, the individual ego and collective psyche, words and affects. This integration is central in order to overcome the one-sided rationalism that characterizes moralistic, legalistic expressions of religion, but even of secular worldviews, whether they are predatory capitalism or repressive forms of socialism. To understand the intrapsychic meaning, Drewermann says we need to understand the evolutionary and paleoanthropological experiences that have over millions of years created our psyche. One way to learn what these archetypal universal symbols are, and they appear culturally in variations, is by looking at religions from all over the world to see whether there are certain similar motifs and patterns that emerge. If we stay with the symbol of the Holy Meal or of the cross, we can find similar symbols in many religions that are connected to the image of the tree. In my book, I describe a range of myths Drewermann mentions in which cross-shaped symbolism appears. What I want to emphasize here is that many of the stories in myth and fairy tales around the world establish a remarkable and to all appearances archetypal symbolic equation of tree and woman or mother, with a noticeable emphasis on themes of birth and cannibalism. This was a quote from Drewermann. Now, while this may sound gross, if it is understood in an external way, it can be a symbol of integration psychically if it is understood symbolically as something that is related to primordial experiences and longings. And Carl Gustav Jung was a master in doing this. Psychologically, the tree became a symbol for the mother in human evolution as hominoid primates stepped out of the forests into the steppe, and dependent infants sought security by climbing up on their mothers, who were also their source of food. So security and food was connected there. The experience of seeking security by holding on to someone is still something we see today. It is deeply rooted in our animal past. You just have to watch a squirrel run up a tree, and you know what I mean. But the symbolism of the cross goes a step further than this objective level aspect of security, because again, here is somewhat of an objective level interpretation in relation to a mother or so. But we want to go into the subjective level interpretation that has to do with intrapsychic relations. The death on the tree gets connected intrapsychically inside the psyche with the wish to regress to the bliss prior to birth. This is often portrayed in myth as union with the mother. It is important, Drewermann argues, to follow Jung here and understand this kind of symbolism expresses subjectively, quote, the longing for union with the archetypal symbol of the mother in one's own psyche, unquote. So with the maternal in one's own psyche, with the nurturing aspect in one's own psyche, so to speak. So in a subjective level perspective, the symbolism of the crucified Redeemer is thus not understood in Freudian terms as the sadomasochistic edible victory of the son against the father, by the son uniting with the maternal cross, but as, quote, an image for the paradoxical union of the ego with the unconscious, hence as an image for the paradoxical wholeness of the human person. By pointing to the latent unity of death and life and to the return to the origin and to renewal of life, this meaning comes closest to the religious message of the symbolism of the cross. Unquote. Drewermann stresses that this subjective level meaning finds expression in the fact that Christianity has connected the symbolism of the cross and resurrection with the sacrament of baptism, that is, the act of rebirth in the unity of death and resurrection. This connection, he states, is religiously even more fundamental than the connection to the oral sadistic sphere of experience in form of the Eucharist. It is more fundamental because it addresses the aspect of a fundamental intrapsychic change in relation between the historical ego and the collective unconscious. The crucifixion is on this level understood as a dying of the one-sidedly rational and external orientation of life in the service of an integration of the vital forces of the unconscious. Only when interpreted as an intrapsychic process can the crucifixion in its concrete symbolism be understood not sadomasochistically. When the ego gives up its one-sidedly rational stance, a rebirth of the whole person, of the true self, occurs. When Christianity talks about obedience and taking upon one's cross, it is not against the true self, but rather actually first about the finding of the true full personality of oneself. That is how it should be correctly understood, Drewermann argues. It is this obedience to one's true self which theology would then mean when it says God demands obedience from humans. This will be very significant when we look in next week's lecture at the devastating effects of the ideal of obedience on the clergy and on people in Christianity in general. And in that last lecture that we'll have next week, we will also look at how this ideal of obedience can be interpreted in a different way for clergy and for Christians in general. But here, to just sum this up in a brief sentence, so self-realization is thus not the opposite of faith, but is its expression. So self-realization is thus not the opposite of faith, but its expression. Now I need to close with a very important clarification here. Theologians who criticize Drewermann because he used Jung to get at the inner meaning of the symbol of the cross as a process of self-integration, charged that Drewermann would be reducing theology and religion to psychology. In fact, that was the reason for his official silencing by his archbishop at the behest of Pope Benedict XVI. But nothing could be further from the truth. Drewermann is very clear that we cannot simply assume a natural movement in the psyche toward wholeness that happens automatically. The psyche has the potential for these natural processes toward self-integration, but it needs the experience of a profound trust in relation to another person to experience this, which theologically assumes in the background of life an unconditional acceptance. The reason is the absolute fear of the self-reflective spirit that we already mentioned, that has to do with each of us experiencing ourselves as unique persons. The way we experience our personhood, whether we experience it characterized as absolutely affirmed or not, is crucial also for how we experience the archetypes of our collective unconscious. That is why it is absolutely important to differentiate between a God image and God. Here is how I describe it on page 269 of my book, A Violent God Image. This is the point where Drewermann emphasizes on theological grounds, in critical differentiation from Jung, the absolute importance of the personal and relational dimension as a condition for the process of self-realization and interpsychic unity. Drewermann writes, only the psychology of fear shows how blocked a human being must remain if he does not see himself in his existence completely carried by an absolute freedom. The inner process of self-realization does not come about merely because the psychic image of the self, of the God, of the psyche pushes toward unfolding. Rather, the forces of self-discovery and self-unfolding are only awoken if there exists a person who faces us and through whose love one's own person for her own sake can feel completely meant, carried, and embraced. Roses bloom only through the medium of light and warmth into their shape. And only within a space of love are humans capable of developing into the shape of their being. This absolute dimension of the personal cannot be reduced to intrapsychic processes because the experience of the absolute significance and importance of one's own person can only come about in relation to another person who through her devotion takes one's own person as absolutely important and significant. If the archetypes of the collective unconscious should have healing instead of destructive effects, Drewermann argues, a human person needs to feel firmly grounded by an absolute person. Discussing the need for both Jung and Freud to understand this dynamic, Drewermann writes, and I'll begin the quote, "One can correctly say that the God image cannot exist apart from humans, as Jung did, but Jung declares God cannot basically exist apart from humans. And that is undoubtedly a transcendent Gnostic assertion in the sense that God is understood as nothing but the God image. It is, however, Drewermann continues, even psychotherapeutically very important to avoid a metaphysicizing of the psychical and a psychologizing of the metaphysical, because the manner in which the archetypes approach the ego of the human person depends very much on the manner in which the ego feels firmly grounded or not vis-a-vis another person. At that point, Freud's objective level perspective will always be right. Humans fail because of people, before they fail because of themselves. And beyond all the images, it is important to believe in a person who lives in all the images, and yet in order to integrate these images must be more than all the images. In order to embark on the path of becoming a person, the human being must be allowed in her consciousness to believe in God as an absolute person who takes away the fear that prevents her from facing the onslaught of her own images. This brings us to the end of this lecture, and I want to briefly sum up. So from the perspective of Jesus, he defeated fear instilled in the name of God by standing by his non-ambivalent, unconditionally accepting faith in God, even when threatened with death. From the perspective of those affected by his message and inspired, empowered, and from this perspective of the human being in general, the sadomasochistic interpretation of the cross can find an end if we understand that psychological and existential dynamics in humans, not in God, are what was acted out toward Jesus, because he portrayed God as non-ambivalent and unconditionally accepting. While initially people welcomed Jesus' message, all the repressed aggressions that had been pushed down in the name of an ambivalent God soon became unleashed onto Jesus. The process of psychotherapy helps us understand this experience, and even can facilitate that experience, Drewermann says. When the early church connected Jesus' death on the cross with a ritual of the Holy Meal, the Lord's Supper or Eucharist, it began to identify the fate of Jesus with God, unconditionally taking our human aggression upon himself. And herein lies the potential redemptive effect of the symbol of the cross. We can symbolically act out our fear-driven aggression in a ritual on God, so that it does not get turned either against ourselves nor against others. And in last week's video lecture, I talked about how this could be a ritual that actually could also solve the problem of war, that we would stop projecting the aggressions outside and acting them out onto the other. But the cross, this is the last part, also symbolizes a profound change in the dynamics within ourselves. The one-sided rationality, which develops out of fear, a fear of the depth of our psyche. So the one-sided rationality, which develops because we are afraid of the depth of our psyche, of our own unconscious, can be overcome when we experience a trust that does not vilify or demonize anything in us, but instead allows us to integrate all of our energies into a process of becoming our unique person. And that is expressed in the symbolism of rebirth or of baptism. Thank you for joining me today in this important lecture and in this important lecture series in general. If you haven't had a chance to look at the first two video lectures, I strongly urge you to do so, which will help you understand more of the context and also gives you the opportunity to understand the so-called story of the fall of Adam and Eve very differently in a non-moralistic way. And also in the second lecture, how war as such could come to an end if we took advantage of the spiritual symbolism in Christianity and in other religions as well. Next week, we will be at our fourth and last lecture. In that lecture, I will be analyzing clergy mentality. So basically the leaders of religion, and focus on working through particularly the harmful effects of the sacrificial mentality that is typically justified with the very kind of sadomasochistic understanding of the cross that we work through with Drewermann today in Christianity. But in other religions, there are similar sacrificial ideologies that also harm the clergy themselves and the people that they serve. So stay tuned for that. That will come out next week on Saturday. Thanks again for listening and have a good week.